Okay. Can you hear me, Nathaniel?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you loud and clear. And we don't have any problems, it seems like. So that's good. So I'm not going to take off your time, but we will have a little question and answer session with you after you're done with this session. So just feel free to continue where you left off.
And I'd like to say up front here that there will be times in this lecture where I'll give either some websites or social media links. If you don't get your question answered today, or you think of a question tomorrow, there's plenty of opportunity for correspondence, and I relish it. And you'll also see that there's research opportunities going forward in which you might be able to participate, but I'm getting ahead of myself, so we'll get there in good time. Thank you again for the opportunity. It is a real privilege for me, I say that sincerely, to be able to speak to you all and to be able to do this remotely. And I really look forward to our time together now. Just to back up for a moment and review what we had covered in our first session of me presenting and us thinking about this together. What we're trying to do is get a preview, a taste of some of the research that is in this new book, Traced Human DNA's Big Surprise. I said I had 9 points. I'm going to cover 8 in this hour, so the pace will be much quicker. But again, even if you don't remember all those 9 points, the bigger point I would hope everyone would be able to walk away with is that this research represents a major milestone in the larger creation evolution debate. This book I wrote 4.5 years ago claims that creation scientists are now not just rebutting Darwin's ideas, but replacing mainstream evolutionary ideas with better ones. And this research represents an example of that, and also a way in which creationists are making major scientific discoveries. So to be able to be living in a time when creationists are doing this is a watershed moment in this creation evolution debate. So that's the big picture point. Again, if you walk away with nothing else, I hope you walk away with that. The 9 points that I wanted to communicate revolve around this metaphor that I've invoked of the Rosetta Stone. Again, the original Rosetta Stone was a literal stone where you had multiple languages inscribed, and it became a key tool by which to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. And so once that was done, now finally the world had a new tool, a new window into Egypt's past. We're calling this new Rosetta Stone, which I said in the previous time together, that this new Rosetta Stone is a DNA-based, generation by generation family tree for global humanity. This new Rosetta Stone gives us a window not just into Egypt's past. We did try to look into that specifically in the previous time, but it's a window into the past of the entire globe. And so hopefully some more of that global implication will come out in this hour. Also some very personal application to you in Norway, because it's relevant to you all as well. And again, just to remind us all, refresh for us all, the tool that we're looking at, I'll come back to it in a slide in a moment, but we're looking at the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA. We can reconstruct a family tree of paternal inheritance. And if you know your biblical history, there's a lot of emphasis on paternal inheritance in the scriptures, and that'll become even more relevant momentarily, just to whet your appetite. So the 9 points I'm calling secrets of this new Rosetta Stone, the secrets that this DNA-based tree holds, one of the major secrets that it holds, and one of the main focuses of the book Traced is the story of peoples, the history of peoples, not just of politics and of culture and of religion, but now we can say, here's who this people group came from, here's what happened to them, whether they went extinct or they still have descendants after their civilization collapsed. The second secret of this new Rosetta Stone, I'm going to put under the label prehistory. Now, prehistory in English, and I apologize, I'm trying to think through any words that may be ambiguous if you translate it into Norwegian, but prehistory, the term that floats around in English, has at least 2 meanings. One of them is used by the evolutionary community to refer to anything basically before human records. So they'll say the time of the dinosaurs, the time of cavemen, all that they lump under the label of prehistory. And if you follow the Ministry of Answers in Genesis, you know that we've said you can't possibly refer to history that way. The Bible gives us the record of the history of the universe, and it's written records from the beginning. There never was an era of prehistory. We've had written records from the start. So prehistory means before written records, and so we'd say there never has been an era of global history where we didn't have records, because the Bible gives us the beginning, from the beginning. Now, there's a second meaning or second application of this term prehistory, and it has a specific meaning in the realm of human history. And we can think of it in biblical terms, and I'm speaking to creationists. I recognize not all of you may be creationists, and so I'm especially glad if you're not, you're coming to listen. I hope there's something for you as well. But if we're thinking this from a biblical creationist perspective, we have the written record of human history post-flood. The Bible tells us that Noah, his wife, his sons and their wives stepped off the ark. We have the written record of that. God told them to multiply. They began to have many offspring. Genesis 11 says that their offspring disobeyed the command to spread out. Instead, they said, we are going to build a tower. We are going to build a city. And so this tower, which eventually was labeled Babel, was an offense to God. God came down and confused their languages so that they could not do that, and it forced them to spread out. And we have a record, I think, of the leaders of that rebellion in Genesis 11 and the heads of those ethno-linguistic groups. Now, I reviewed that history because from that point forward, now we do have the possibility of prehistory, because some of the people groups that left Babel either did not write down their history from that point forward, or it was oral, or some of the records were destroyed, or the records were lost. So one of the most famous examples of this second category of prehistory is what's referred to as the pre-Columbian or pre-European arrival in the Americas. You look at Native American history, and it's almost all oral. Or if you look for written records, some of them were destroyed. And of course, that's a common theme throughout human history. When a new conqueror comes in and subjugates a people, they will oftentimes destroy the records of all those who came prior to give themselves some sort of legitimacy, or they will rewrite the history of those who came before to try to gather to themselves some sort of greater authority. Sadly, this seems to have happened in the pre-Columbian Americas. There are some records inscribed in stone by the Mayans, but these are limited. So for these reasons, the history of the Americas before the arrival of Europeans is often also labeled prehistory. And I'm going to use that term with that very narrow meaning. We're talking about post-Tower of Babel, pre-written records. That you have these scenarios around the globe. We have the biblical history of the globe, but there are certain people groups after they spread out where we've lost their records of who they came from and what they did. So that background is all to set up then this second secret of this new Rosetta Stone, this DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity, gives us some fantastic new insights into eras of human history that we would lump under the label prehistory. Let me give you one example. And let me set this up by first reviewing the mainstream account for Native American history, because there's multiple layers of contrast between the current version of pre-Columbian history and how this Rosetta Stone changes it. So just to review briefly, mainstream science says that humans evolved, anatomically modern humans evolved first in Africa. And this happened about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. And then about 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, these humans migrated out of Africa and began to spread around the globe. And then very late in evolutionary history, only 15,000 years ago, there was another group that migrated across the Bering Strait, arrived in the Americas, and then rapidly spread up and down North and South America. And on top of that, the mainstream scientific community would say, these people have been living in isolation. They would say that the American peoples, the Native American peoples, lived in isolation, disconnected from the old world for 14,500 years until Leif Erikson and Columbus arrived. And so they do not have any correlations with the history that we learn in school about Genghis Khan's empire or the Huns invading Europe or any of these sorts of things. It's all been very isolated in the mainstream view. So even that aspect I want to show you with this new Rosetta Stone changes. So there's some pretty explosive discoveries. So once again, here's this image of a representative example of this new Rosetta Stone. It's a DNA-based, generation by generation family tree from about 600 men. Again, we're looking at the male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome. You've got these various branches color-coded. And again, to give you another illustration of how these labels are applied to the tree, because we're going to look at this branch here called Q in a moment. For deep branches in the tree, and again, deep meaning close to the top, because time goes from top to bottom, ancient times up here, modern times down here. When you have a deep branch, you assign a somewhat arbitrary letter of the alphabet. Again, it doesn't exactly follow alphabetical order. N-O-K? Why is this in this order? Well, it's somewhat arbitrary. And I think it has to do with the order in which some of these lineages were discovered. So Q is a deep branch. It gets its own letter. On this side of the tree is R. But if these branches subdivide, they get a number. R1 on this side, R2 on this side. If it subdivides again, you get another letter. R1A in lavender, R1B in this darkish greenish brown. We're going to look at haplogroup. So haplogroup, I'm sorry, I used a technical term. The branch, the technical name for a branch is haplogroup. So if you see that in these slides, that's what it's referring to. We're going to look at this branch that we've labeled Q because it is one of the most dominant lineages in the Americas. It's the basis for the evolutionists saying that Native Americans came here 15,000 years ago. In fact, if you read the evolutionary literature, they use the term literally a sanity check. One of the major papers that came out in the last, it was published in 2016. They did an analysis of over 1,000 men and their Y chromosomes. And as a check on their evolutionary work, they went to this branch and said, okay, does this break away from Central Asia 15,000 years ago? And if it does, we can breathe a sigh of relief. We're on the right track. That's how vital this branch is to the overall evolutionary analysis. Now, we've looked last time that these dates change dramatically when you say, no, this tree doesn't represent hundreds of thousands of years. It represents just 4,500 years back to Noah. So naturally, the dating of when Q comes from Central Asia into the Americas is also going to change. Before I give you the date, though, let me clarify what this map is showing. The size of these circles, again, represents the relative abundance of this Q in the Americas. And I need to clarify something. Again, you can see very large circles up and down the Americas because it's just abundant here. I need to clarify something because there's a sad reality right now in the Americas today. Let's use Latin America. So anything basically south of the Rio Grande River, so Mexico and on southward into South America, Central and South America, Latin America. If you look at the Y chromosomes of the men in Latin America, 80% of them do not belong to native lineages. They are either European in origin or they are African. So even to this day, there's a danger that the indigenous American lineages will disappear because they're already a major minority. So when I've depicted these circles, I've basically already removed from the equation all the European branches and the African branches because we know they came over in the last few centuries due to European colonialism and to the ugly history of the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so that's the end of my little explanation as to why this is the way it is. Other thing I want to point out to you is that the existence of Q in the old world is largely confined here to, or at least some of the larger circles are in Central Asia. There's tiny little circles in India and China and the Middle East and such. The bigger ones are right here. For some reason, this circle right here, for some reason, the Turkmen of Turkmenistan, about 50% of them belong to group Q. It's a separate branch from the Q in the Americas, and there's some history there that is still worth figuring out. But that's one of the rare exceptions of a larger circle in the old world. As a general rule, Q is fairly rare in the old world. There's also a larger circle up here. I think this is the Selkuk people of Russia. They are nearly extinct. And so the fact that they have a large circle, I don't think has tremendous historical significance. And what I mean is, when you have a population that is shrinking in size and it's down to a very small number, 2,000 people or so, you can get artifacts of statistics where there may once have been a large diversity of genetic lineages, of branches on the family tree, but because the population is shrinking and getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and you're losing some of that history because the population is declining, you can artificially amplify certain lineages that don't have that much historical relevance. Now, there's one other thing I want to point out to you. There is a small circle here in Iceland, and so I will tell you from the outset, there is a Scandinavian connection that we're going to return to here in a moment. So it is relevant even to you watching in the room right now. I'm going to focus first, though, on the narrative that emerges for the Americas from this particular branch. The evolutionary community says this branch separated from Central Asia 15,000 years ago. If you say no, this represents just 4,500 years of history, this branch arrives in the Americas in the AD 300s to 600s. And let me stop here for a second in case you're wondering how that could possibly be true. I've got a couple of papers. I've got a paper on this, and there's also some details in the book. The way I arrived at this conclusion was to first start with data that we know. In case you're not familiar with this, there's a revolution happening in mainstream American archaeology. You go back to the 1950s, 1940s, it was commonly thought that the Native Americans were very small in their population sizes, that they lived in harmony with the environment and did very little to transform it, lived in sort of a Stone Age type technology for thousands of years, and all that changed when Europeans arrived. Based on archaeology and newly discovered historical records, even mainstream science is now viewing this differently. They now would say there were millions upon millions of people here in the Americas on the eve of Columbus's arrival. Middle of the road estimates would say that approximately 50 to 60 million people were in the Americas in 1491. And just for comparison, mainstream estimates for the population of Europe in 1400 were 60 million. So there's a lot of people here. And secondly, they were profoundly transforming the environment. There's an increasing amount of evidence accumulating showing that in the Central American jungles, in the South American Amazon rainforests, these were highly transformed environments during the time of the Native Americans. One estimate said about 11% of the Amazon rainforest looks like an ancient cultivated orchard. This is really revolutionary stuff that's coming from the mainstream folks themselves. And I've brought that up because one of the consequences of this revolutionary view, one of the outcomes of this study is that, yes, number one, there were lots of people here, and number two, nearly 90% of them died when Europeans arrived, one of the most tragic events in human history. Now, I've told you that part because you should be able to see the smoking gun of that in this DNA, and you do. In fact, you only see the smoking gun. The population collapsed for 300 years after the arrival of Europeans, and then the recovery about the 1800s. You only see that history when you have the young Earth timescale. So I'm going to stop here and just make an apologetic point. The young Earth timescale, when you apply to genetics, is the only timescale that recapitulates known human history. The evolutionary model is inferior. It can't do it as well as young Earth creation-based genetics. It's one of the arguments for the validity of this model. And so that was one of the first steps I took before rewriting the pre-Columbian era. I said, first, how do we know this is working? Let's see if we can capture with this young Earth timescale what we know happened after Columbus arrived. It worked. And so then I turned around and said, what does this tell us about pre-Columbian history? So that's the end of my little justification for how I got to this conclusion, in case you're wondering. And the book goes through some of this as well. Okay, so back to our narrative of what's going on in the pre-Columbian Americas. The dominant lineage is Q, and it appears to arrive in the 300s to 600s AD. And again, these circles are large. This is what, it's not the exclusive lineage in the Americas. I'll talk about one other one in a moment, but it's the most ancient lineage that we have and the most dominant one that we have. And this has massive implications then for pre-Columbian history. Number one, we have archaeological evidence for civilizations in the Americas before the 300s to 600s AD. The Olmecs, the creators of these gigantic sculpted heads, are a cradle of civilization. They're dated to about 1500 BC. They were on the decline about the 400s BC when the Mayans arose. Now, recent archaeological work might actually bump the origins of Mayan civilization back several centuries to 1000 BC. The bigger point here is that the arrival of Group Q post-dates the origins of both of those civilizations. And yet today, the dominant lineage, the dominant Native American lineage, is Q. So whoever these people were, they appear to have arrived and then replaced, perhaps conquered, those who were here earlier. Or to say it in perhaps a politically incorrect way, today's Native Americans were not the first Americans. There were at least two other groups here before them. This is a dramatically new conclusion in how we understand the prehistory, the pre-Columbian Americas. There's a second thing I'm going to draw out here, though, that's exciting to me. Sure, what I just said is politically incorrect, but it anchors Native American history firmly in the history that we learn in school. And this is what I mean. You probably heard about the history of the Roman Empire and the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 300s and 400s AD at the hands of multiple peoples, including a group known as the Huns. Now, the Huns, the origin of the Huns is still disputed in mainstream science. I think the mainstream scientists would agree there was some sort of Central Asian people group that came in. Exactly who they came from is a matter of controversy, but they came from Central Asia, 400s, 300s, 400s AD, and they were part of the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. The world history I learned in school, I've come to recognize, was probably more akin to a history of Western civilization. I don't recall learning much about the history of India and China and such. Perhaps that's been your experience as well. What is essentially the equivalent of the Roman Empire in the East was the Han Chinese dynasty, which lasted from the 200s BC to the 200s AD. And when the Han collapsed, it was again Central Asians coming in and ruling that era. So my point in bringing this up is mainstream history that we learn in school recognizes that in the 200s to 400s AD, something was stirring in Central Asia, so much so that the classic civilizations of human history, Roman Empire, Han Chinese dynasty, were both falling or had some sort of involvement with invaders from Central Asia. And this is such a significant era that you may have even heard the German word that's used to describe this. It's the Völkerwanderung, or the great wandering of peoples. Something's happening in Central Asia where there seems to be some connections here. Central Asian peoples are on the move, and they're leading to the downfalls of these great civilizations. Now, why is that relevant? Because Group Q leaves Central Asia around exactly that same time, the 300s to 600s AD, comes into the Americas. Now, is there a Roman equivalent? Is there an American equivalent of the Roman Empire in the Americas? I think yes. The classic era of the Mayan civilization is 250 AD to about the 700s to 900s AD when it collapses for reasons that are still disputed. We almost have a repetition of the old world history in the Americas. This group of, I'm just calling this Group Q, Branch Q, the Wanderers, they're also leaving whatever is stirring here in Central Asia, except they're coming to the Americas, and may have played a causal role in the downfall of the Mayan civilization. The date for the spread of Q across the Americas appears to be about 600 AD, which would put it about a century or two before the Mayan civilization collapses. 600 AD is the century when one of the greatest cities of the Americas, Teotihuacan in Mexico, undergoes, according to archaeology, a violent overthrow. I think that's a very likely cause-effect scenario. These guys, this Group Q, comes over and overthrows Teotihuacan. They may have also played a role in the downfall of the Mayans. So my bigger point here is Group Q, this new history that's revealed by this family tree, gives it, I think, a very clear explanation for what's going on. It anchors Native American history in the history of the whole world and shows it's all connected, which I feel like it adds to the value of all this. So Q arrives from Central Asia around the 300s to 600s AD. This is one of the things we can see from the tree. It's around the time of the same time as the Great Wandering of Peoples, this monumental era of human history in which there are these Central Asian peoples going on conquest for reasons that are still unknown. Now, I want to return to what I mentioned here about Iceland having about 5 to 6% of modern Icelanders belonging to haplogroup Q as well. What does this mean? And I want to mention, okay, there's no circle here in Norway. That doesn't mean there isn't Q in Norway. The study that I referenced in the book, the one that I just happened to pick, I think looked at only 20 Norwegians. And so if Q exists at levels of 1 to 5% in Norway, that study probably wouldn't capture it. Another reason I'm bringing it up is because I've had a number of folks write into me, and I'll give you the website here in a moment, discussing their Y chromosome tests. You know, of course, genetic testing is fairly popular these days, and there are people of European, and in fact, one person of Scandinavian descent who belongs to an unusual Q lineage. My point in bringing this up is this is a very fascinating lineage. There's a good chance some of you watching may in fact belong to this. This may have some connection to the migration of the Huns. The bigger point is there's still a lot of human history yet to be uncovered. And I find it fascinating, and some of you watching may have in your DNA right now the clues to how this works out. And so here's the website. If you go to answersingenesis.org/go/traced, traced just the title of the book, you'll see this page. The original purpose for the page was to give you the supplemental material. That's still there. But there's also now a button on this page. If you click it, or you just scroll down, it'll take you to a spot where you can enter your name, your email, your message. And if you do that, this will go straight to my email inbox. And I've had over 450 people do this now. Probably half of them are saying, I took a genetic test. Here's my result. What does it mean? What's the history? Who does it connect to? And to give away where I'm about to go, which son of Noah does it connect to? And I'll tell you why they asked that question in a moment. This is how I found out about 2 people right now in the United States of European descent, one of Scandinavian descent, who belong to this unusual Q lineage. And so we're working together going forward to try to figure out what exactly this means. So again, there's much history yet to be uncovered. We're just scratching the surface at the early stages. Okay, that's the side note, and we'll probably come back to more of Norwegian history in a few moments. I want to continue this narrative of Native American history because there's another aspect that I haven't told you about. There is a second indigenous lineage in the Americas. It's known as branch C in red. Now in this next slide, I've got multiple colors, not red, because in this branching structure of C, for reasons I don't have time to go into right now, there appears to have been an ancient migration out of Siberia, down through Japan, through the Philippines, into Indonesia, at which point one subgroup went over to India, another group kept going to the east, which again, there was another subgroup breaks away, goes down to the Australia and becomes part of the Australian Aborigines. Another group keeps going as part of the Polynesians, eventually reaches all the way out here to Easter Island. The Native American haplogroup C, I've colored here pink, because we can see that it came from this original Siberian group. It wasn't migrations from the Pacific Islands. Okay, another thing I want you to notice is, again, the size of the circles represents the relative abundance. These circles are smaller. The Q circles are all quite large because it's dominant. C is smaller. That's one observation. The second thing is I want to tell you now the date at which this American C, or I should say what was originally Central Asian or Siberian C, arrived in the Americas, and the date is even later. It's about 1000 AD. Second settling of the Americas from genetics alone. I don't have time to fully justify these next few slides that I'm going to show you. The point that I want you to walk away with, though, is 1000 AD is once again a time of stirring of the peoples of Central Asia. If you look at the genetic origins of most people of Western European descent, I'll use myself as an example. Yes, my mother is German, my dad is an American, but my last name, Jeanson, is of French derivation, Western Europe, and I belong to this R1b branch. I've had my Y chromosome tested, and it's R1b, this branch that I'm going to show you, exists at levels of 50 to 75% of the men in Western Europe. That's the side note. The point of R1b is R1b came into Western Europe in the Middle Ages. You can see this. If you map out the various sub-branches on the R1b section of the tree, when these branches originate, you can see early branches closer to Central Asia, later branches during the Middle Ages coming in here to Eastern Europe, Middle Ages again, Eastern Europe, and it's only late in history that these R1b branches flee what I think appears to be the Balkans and migrate into Central Europe, Western Europe. So S116 is the specific subgroup to which I belong, which is heavy in France. So that was satisfying to see this match between the genetics and the family last name. There's sort of a Mediterranean branch. There's an island Europe branch with high levels in Ireland and Great Britain, and a sub-branch of that as well. You can basically map out a path. And my point is, the era in which one of the most dominant Western European branches comes into Europe is around 1000 AD, which we know from history was a period in which the Magyars, the ancestors of the Hungarians, came into Europe. There's a whole bunch of Turkic peoples, Pechenegs, Oghuz, Kipchaks, right around 1000 AD. They're migrating into Europe. R1b seems to be the genetic echo of this. And again, I've mentioned all this because this is the exact same time when apparently another subgroup of Central Asians went the opposite direction, from Central Asia and now to the Americas. So this, again, anchors Native American history firmly in the realm of history we learn in school, which I think is exciting. It's not this big mystery anymore. There's a group of Native American languages in the Americas right now that may correspond to this. It's the Athabascan language family. So again, language families are just bigger groupings of existing languages. If you know anything about Native American groups today, the Navajos and the Apaches are down here in the southwestern United States. Both of those languages are Athabascan, and they connect up here further north to Canada and Alaska. And the migration of the Navajos and the Apaches from the north down here into the southwestern United States appears to have been just a few centuries before the Spanish arrived. There were Pueblo peoples down here in the southwestern United States who lived there before the Navajos and the Apaches, and they say, yes, the Navajos and the Apaches, they came late in history, perhaps 1000 AD or 1200 AD, just a few centuries before the Spanish came up from Mexico. So that seems fairly close to the timing of this migration. So I'm wondering if there's a connection there. So at this point, I want to work our way backwards in time to lay out for you in just a few short slides. Here's the history of the pre-Columbian Americas as we currently understand it, and here's the mysteries that remain. So the most recent migration from Asia to the Americas appears to have been about 1000 AD. It gave rise to a minority of indigenous lineages today, but it's again it's connected to other old world Central Asian migrations that I didn't have time to get into. The dominant lineage came several centuries prior to that. It left Central Asia around the time of the Völkerwanderung, the great wandering of peoples, just like the Huns left and went the opposite direction. They arrived and apparently wiped out whoever was here before. And I say that because we do not yet have the genetic echo of the Mayan civilization. Now, there are millions of men in the Americas who have yet to get a Y chromosome test. So I'm hoping it's still out there and is yet to be discovered. The evolutionary community isn't even looking for this sort of thing because, again, they think 15,000 years ago is the rule. They think Q fits that. And so what reason do we have to go looking for something more ancient than that? Young Earth creationists do. And I've actually got a Native American study group I'm working with right now. Of the 450 people who've responded, several were Native Americans, and we're trying to get together to try to unravel more of this history, perhaps do some more genetic investigation, look at some more of the oral histories. And anyway, that's a whole other long story. Again, I can't get into, but very exciting. I have some suspicions as to who may have given rise to the Mayans. Let's just take this date, 400s BC, as a starting point. What was going on in East Asia in the 400s BC? If you know anything about Chinese history, from about the 700s BC to about the 200s BC was one of the most tumultuous times in all of East Asian history. It's the the spring and autumn period, and I think I got the name right. And then later is the Warring States period. So here's a map of that. No unified China, constant fighting, and in fact, some of the surrounding peoples will trace their origin to some of these warring states that eventually lost. So the Vietnamese will say that they came from one of these warring states from this era of history. The Koreans say we came from up here in Manchuria. So there's a lot of upheaval. There are surrounding peoples who trace their origins to around this time. So would it be any surprise if perhaps another one of these warring states, perhaps one of the losers, instead of being conquered by the emerging Chinese empire, flees and ends up fleeing to the Americas? I think that's an intriguing hypothesis. I don't yet know the answer. The way to find the answer will be to keep looking through the genetics of the people in the Americas. And my hope is that further research, and yes, creation scientists are doing research, it's a new day, it's a new era, will reveal the answer. The other group, of course, being the Olmecs that we know from archaeology. They're a cradle of civilization. They're even more ancient. We do not yet have their lineage. I wonder if that lineage went extinct, because again, they disappear basically 2,400 years ago, never to rule again. And given how much subsequent population collapse occurred in the Americas, it just may be gone. But if it still exists, my guess is it's some unique lineage that doesn't belong to any existing one. For the Mayans, it wouldn't surprise me if their branch connects to some of the existing East Asian branches, but perhaps 400 BC or so. Anyway, this is still another area of research that I hope to further investigate. I said I had 8 points to make in this lecture, and I intended to spend that much time on this prehistory one because it's so explosive. And it's, again, one example of, under the general heading of prehistory, you can do this sort of analysis for pre-colonial Africa, pre-colonial Pacific, and there's exciting things that emerge there as well. So I'm now going to go fairly rapid fire through these last 7 points and just give you some brief illustrations of this. I've already alluded to this third secret. So the first secret of this new Rosetta Stone is history, the history of peoples. Second is prehistory. We've got new insights to these eras of human history, pre-written records, post-Babel. Third secret of the new Rosetta Stone is a point-for-point match between biblical anthropology and the early parts of the Y chromosome tree. So I alluded to this history earlier. Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives come off the ark, 8 people in total. Genesis 10 gives us the male descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. You probably can't read these names, but in blue is Shem's descendants, green is Japheth's, pink is Ham's. Genesis 10 tells us that there were different generations realized in Shem's lineage versus Japheth's versus Ham. You can see most of the names here in Ham's lineage are in generation 3. Half of Shem's descendants are in generation 6. I bring that up because you can see that level of precision at the base of this Y chromosome tree. I won't go through all the evidence. Chapter 13 of the book does. But the bottom line is you can see almost a mirror image of this in the Y chromosome tree. It's one of the strongest arguments for this representing the biblical anthropology. And there's many more other lines of biblical evidence that line up here, which again, for sake of time, I won't go through. So the third secret is Noah. He's right there at the base of the tree. You can see it. The fourth secret is another aspect of biblical history I think is worth mentioning as a separate point. I'm going to zoom in here on Shem's lineage. Genesis 10 takes you down from Shem through Arphaxad, Salah, Eber, Peleg. Why is Peleg significant? Because if you go to Genesis 11, the next chapter, that takes Peleg's genealogy down through Ru, Serug, Nahor, Terah, Abraham. And of course, subsequent chapters of Genesis tell us that Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob, and Jacob gave rise to the 12 tribes of Israel. You can count off these generations in Scripture. You can count off those generations in this family tree. We have identified the genealogical echo of Abraham and likely Isaac and Jacob. In the book, I say it's Isaac and Jacob. I've spoken to about 400 Arabs, Muslim Arabs, who of course want to know if they go back to Ishmael, and it's caused me to rethink some of this. Many of them are quite offended that I didn't identify their lineage as the Abrahamic one, but there are others who are interested in this, and I'm in communication with them, who want to know more about this. And there's the possibility that we may be able to recover the genealogical line of all 12 tribes of Israel. Right now, we only have 2 lines from Abraham that I could possibly associate with the 12 tribes. But again, 99% of the men that are alive today have yet to get a Y chromosome test. So I anticipate that as more men get Y chromosome tests, some of these, the lineages of these ancient Israelite tribes will emerge. So fourth secret, I'm labeling Israel. You could call it Abraham, but there's another biblical echo. Fifth secret takes this information and makes it personal. Any of you men watching, if you get a Y chromosome test, I can tell you exactly which son of Noah you come from. Now, ladies, you're not left out. Let me explain it this way. And I want to make 2 points here. Number one, the limits, even for men, of what a Y chromosome test can tell you. And then secondly, what to do if you're a lady. So here's the limits of a Y chromosome test. A Y chromosome test tells you only your unbroken line of male descent. I got my Y chromosome from my dad, who got it from his dad, who got it from his dad, and on back you go. It does not tell you your father's mother's side, or your mother's father's side, or your mother's mother's side. There's a lot of information that's missed. So I bring this up because, I mean, even I tend to think this way. I get my Y chromosome tested and I find out who my people are. Well, that's not quite the reality of our family trees. All of us have multiple genealogical inputs to us. In fact, I can tell you that there's a high probability that each of you probably come from at least 2 sons of Noah. It's not like, oh, we just come from this line. It's human history is messy, and the family trees in human history are all interconnected. So it's if you're really interested in who you come from, it's worth having multiple people take Y chromosome tests. What do I mean? What about dad's mother's side? Well, if you can find, and I hope to do this, my dad's mother's brother or some male descendant on this part of the family tree, if he gets a Y chromosome test. What I can tell you that we've done so far is I've done my Y chromosome, and my mother's brother in Germany has had his Y chromosome tested. And by the way, this is a whole other discussion. There's a 95% chance for you couples that your family line, your family lines connect just 600 years ago. Or another way to put it, there's a 95% chance that my father's side of the family tree connects to my mother's side of the family tree just 600 years ago. There's a 95% chance that my mom's side and my dad's side are at least 25th cousins. Let me put it yet another way. There's a 95% chance that my side and my wife's side of the family tree are connected just 600 years ago, and that we're much more closely related than perhaps I'm comfortable with. I didn't do a genetic testing before we got married. This is stuff I've discovered since we got married, but it's true for all of us. There's a lot of connections. We've done Y chromosome testing for my wife's side. My father-in-law has had his Y chromosome tested. My mother-in-law's brother has had his Y chromosome tested. And for some of you, you may not need to do any Y chromosome testing. For my father-in-law's mother's side, there was a whole Facebook page dedicated to the origin of the family name. And there were many males who had already done a Y chromosome test. And so we didn't need to do anything. We just looked up the information. So that may be relevant to some of you as well. And another thing I want to mention here, why it may be additionally relevant to you, I did say that there's a mirror image between the Genesis 10 genealogy and the Y chromosome tree. There's a little caveat. Genesis 10 gives 70 names approximately. There are only about 10 to 15 deep lineages in this tree. What that means then, again, is because 99% of the men have yet to get a Y chromosome test alive on the globe, those ancient branches, those ancient lineages from Genesis 10 are probably still out there and waiting to be discovered. You might have in your DNA the genetic echo of one of these lost peoples of the ancient world. So there's your fifth secret. And again, if you have an unusual test result or any sort of question, or you want to participate in future research, you can go to this website, answersingenesis.org/go/traced. Now, I'm speaking in English. You can write to me in Norwegian. I've had communication basically via Google Translate with some of these Arabs. They've written to me in Arabic, and we've used Google Translate. It's a little bit trickier because it's such a different language. I don't think Google Translate works that well. But again, Norwegian is close to German, and I can speak German, so I'm confident we can communicate quite well. Fifth secret has to do with how we think about race and, the sixth secret has to do with how we think about race and ethnicity. And I'll make it personal for Scandinavia and Norway. How many people in Scandinavia have light skin and light hair and think that they're related to the Vikings? You'll notice from this map, this is the branch that we talked about in the previous time, that E1B1B, there is a small percentage up here in Norway. I think it's about 5% of Norwegians belong to this E1B branch. And so according to the Y chromosome, their unbroken line of male descent does not go back to the Vikings. It does not even go back to light-skinned peoples. It goes back to olive-skinned Arabs about the 600s AD. And of course, the story doesn't stop there. The olive-skinned Arabs go back to the dark-skinned Nubians of ancient times. And the story still doesn't stop there because some of the Nubians sat on the throne of ancient Egypt. So the good news is, or the exciting news is, some of you might actually have royal Egyptian blood flowing through your veins and you didn't know it. So all hail to the descendants of the pharaohs, not necessarily King Tut, but there is, some of you have links apparently to ancient Egypt. And the larger point I'm making as it relates to social issues is, this is but one example of many where the so-called races appear to have changed multiple times in human history. There are light-skinned people who have had dark-skinned ancestors, dark-skinned people who have had light-skinned ancestors, Asian people with African ancestors, African people with Asian ancestors. How can we even talk about white, black, Asian, African? How can any person try to advance an argument that somehow this race is superior to that race, or that race is inferior to this race? Those basic terms all lose their meaning in light of this history. Imagine if every school child grew up learning this history. What a tremendous antidote to racism and these sorts of ideas that exist in society to this day. Okay, I'm low on time. We're down to the last 3 points. The seventh secret of the New Rosetta Stone deals with missions and indigenous histories. You already have an example of this from the previous hour of the oral histories of the Bantu peoples finding an echo in the Y chromosome tree. I've got an increasing number of examples of indigenous histories where people say, this is who we came from. Mainstream science will tend to ignore or neglect those because, well, what do we do with it? Or maybe the time scale that these people imply is too short for the mainstream view. There's a number of examples now of indigenous histories finding an exact echo in the Y chromosome tree. So why do I say this is relevant to missions? Let's say you're a Bible translator and you go to New Guinea, and the New Guineans, not Christians, don't have the scripture, and they have their own account of who they came from. That may actually be true. And you might find an echo of that in this Y chromosome tree. Well, why is that relevant? You can then take that Y chromosome tree and say, look, your story starts here in Genesis 10. These people are your ancestors. Or to put it in a term that a Bible translator told me, who had been in New Guinea, he said, this is really exciting. He said, he's light-skinned like me. He said, this is exciting because then we can go to these people and say, look, the Bible isn't just a white man's book. Your story, your history begins right here. We could make that case in a general way, just having the scriptures themselves, Genesis 10, Genesis 11. We can now make that case very precisely with these sorts of genetic data. And again, if you are a missionary or you know missionaries, contact me. I've had a couple already do that. There is a missionary right now doing translation in New Guinea. We've had a discussion about, is there a way we can give them the scriptures and their history connected right back to Genesis 10? I think that's very exciting. Eighth secret. I don't think I have to tell you that the concept of the universe being just 6,000 years old is viewed as crazy in Western society. In Europe, in the United States, people will laugh you out of the room. They think you're crazy. The research in this book, the research behind this book, I think is one of the strongest arguments in print for the recent origin of humanity for a number of reasons. And I'll just walk through these real fast. Number one, you can see Genesis 10 at the base of the tree. Number two, we're dealing with human history. So my book, Replacing Darwin, is about the general origin of species. So if you're trying to do evangelism on the street and you tell them, hey, did you know that the natural history of fruit flies matches the Bible? Okay, who cares? If you tell them, hey, the story in your DNA, your history, your family's history matches the DNA, matches the account in Scripture, now it's personal. And I think all that more intriguing to people that we're trying to witness to. So you can see that at the base of the tree. Really the big picture apologetic aspect of this book is that we can see all sorts of stamps of known human history, of all these various empires in our DNA. And you shouldn't see it in that way if evolution is true. So in a sense, this book is one log argument saying if the Bible is true, and civilization is basically from the flood till now, then you should see all these echoes of civilization in our DNA, and we do. And so there's another argument for the veracity of the young Earth timescale. Last point, and then we'll close, brings us back to where we started. And I'm gonna elaborate on this history. So I said, if you walk away with only one point, I want you to walk away with the point that creationists are now making major scientific discoveries. Here's why that's so apologetically relevant. So let me just sketch the history of creation science very quickly for you. And you're probably already familiar with aspects of it. I tend to look to 1961 as a milestone in the modern young Earth creation movement. That's when the book The Genesis Flood was published by Henry Morris and John Whitcomb. I view myself as a sort of a descendant of that movement, a second or third generation creationist. That book really got things restarted in the United States. That led to the formation of the Institute for Creation Research in the 1970s. And anyway, there's a long history there. And one of the consequences of this history is that creation scientists have come up with very strong arguments against evolution and very strong arguments for design. Even Richard Dawkins concedes, this is a direct quote from his book that put so famously, he said, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So even Richard Dawkins, one of the world's most famous atheists, concedes life looks designed. He wants you to deny what your eyes tell you and believe that it's evolution that gives the appearance of design, not design itself. But even he recognizes this. Now, the evolutionists have said this is not enough. They've said it's not enough to poke holes in evolution. It's not enough to give us arguments for design. Now, I'm saying there's good arguments against evolution, good arguments for design. I'm not giving you my opinion. I'm saying this is what they say. So that raises the question, what else could anyone ask for? What's missing? What are evolutionists demanding before they recognize creation science as science? There's one common argument that has been consistent over the past 40 years, at least in the United States, and I think you've probably heard it in Norway as well. I'll give you a quote, and I think you'll see the concept behind it immediately. Here's a quote from a book from 1982, because again, this goes back at least 40 years, but it's worked its way into federal court decisions in the United States. It's long been a part of the anti-creationist literature. It's found its way into textbooks. Here's the argument. Niles Eldredge, a famous paleontologist, wrote a book called The Monkey Business. A scientist looks at creationism, in which he strongly argues against creation science, and here's one of his reasons. He says creation science isn't science at all, nor have creation scientists managed to come up with even a single intellectually compelling, scientifically testable statement about the natural world. So the common form of this, so let's say you're witnessing to your neighbor, you're doing street evangelism, you might hear someone say, well, creation science isn't science. Or to put it in terms from this previous slide, perhaps you're witnessing to someone and you say, hey, evolution, how does evolution explain the origin of male and female? And maybe the evolutionist says, well, that's kind of a tough one. Okay, but then they'll say, but that doesn't mean you're right. We don't have an explanation yet for that problem in evolution, but you can't say therefore creation is right because creation isn't science. Creation is just religion. That's what this is coming down to. It's a long-standing fallback. You can give argument after argument against evolution, and still the evolutionist, the unbeliever, will say, that's not good enough. You have to come up with something better. For example, they might say, you creationists believe that God created kinds of creatures, and that today's species descend from the kinds Noah took on board the ark. Predict for me, make a testable statement. Predict for me how many new species are going to form this year. And if you can't, it's not a scientific position. They'd say gravity makes predictions. The laws of physics make predictions. We trust these laws of physics to work in the future when Danny Faulkner's flown to Norway there. He's trusting that the laws of physics will work when he hopped on the plane. He's trusting that they'll continue to work when he sits down in his seat again and flies back to the United States. These laws of physics make predictions, and we trust them to work. That's what the evolutionists are demanding. And I bring that up because that's exactly what creation science has delivered. That's the background for this book, replacing Darwin. I put specific testable predictions in print. I talked about some of them being fulfilled with Darwin's finches. One of the other predictions I put in print, this is a long quote, I won't read it to you, but I said specifically, if the young Earth creation model is true, we should be able to read off the history of civilization in our DNA. I specifically mentioned the Y chromosome. I did not have the data entraced at that time. It was still experiments to be done in the future. Those predictions have been fulfilled. And on top of that, like every good scientific idea, it makes even more predictions. That's the basis for looking for even more of these lost lineages of the ancient world, for looking for the ancient lineages of the first Americans, and so on and so forth. There's even more predictions. This is a full-fledged scientific model that's advancing our knowledge of the world. Creation scientists are making major scientific discoveries now, and this marks the dawn of a new era. It delivers what the evolutionists have demanded for over 40 years. So, just to review then, the 9 secrets of this new Rosetta Stone. This DNA-based generation-by-generation family tree for global humanity contains, number 1, the history of peoples. Number 2, it contains explosive revelations about eras of human history that have long lacked this sort of tool, prehistory. It has at its base Noah himself and his 3 sons. You can see that genealogical line of Abraham in this tree as well. We can connect every male's ancestry back to specific sons of Noah, specific men in Genesis 10. I can say that my branch, the common Western European branch, R1b, goes back to a son of Joktan, descendant of Shem. That's the level of detail we can do. This rewrites contemporary social debates about race and ethnicity. Big contributions there. New tools for missions. Even stronger arguments confirming the biblical timescale as it relates to humanity, and a turning of the tables in the creation evolution debate. I'll have some more videos. I think I forgot to include a slide here. Let me check here for a moment. Nope, I do have the slide. I'll tell you about the response, how the critics are actually helping me make this point here in a moment. So, preview of this book. Again, if you've been tracking Answers in Genesis, 2020, so 2 years ago, right about this time, we were in the middle of a 25-part series called A New History of the Human Race. And I just realized this is not the slide I wanted. I wanted to show you another slide. Anyway, we promised a book. This new book is a fulfillment of it. Here's where I want to say there is now a second video series. We've done about 6 videos now, giving a preview, sort of a chapter-by-chapter preview of this book, that if you go to our Answers in Genesis YouTube page, click on playlists, you can go to, in fact, let me do this here real fast for you, and then I'll stop for questions. I think I can slide this over. Yeah. So now you should be able to see my browser window. And I'm going to go to this new playlist, so don't misquote it. Sorry, it's taking a minute to load. Here we go. So traced DNA's big surprise. That's this new playlist. We've already got about 6 videos that have populated this. There's more coming. We'll probably have close to 20 by the time we're done. The next videos that are coming out will cover the remaining chapters that I didn't hit yet. Then we'll talk about the science behind traced, about 5 videos going through. Here's what's happened over the past 10 years. Predictions, fulfillments, predictions, fulfillments. There's a pattern of this science working, and then we'll conclude with some responses to the critics. It appears to have stirred up some responses among the opponents of creation science, who have had a lot to say about this. There we go, got my mouse back. And they've actually given us great gifts. They're actually responding to this research in a way they've accused creationists of responding to evolution. We've come completely full circle. You couldn't ask for a better gift from the evolutionary community. So stay tuned for that if you're interested in finding out some more of the responses and science behind it there too. Again, you got this website to get in touch with me. Strongly encourage you to go there. And we've got Replacing Darwin and the simpler version of that here as well. I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop. Oh, that means I should stop sharing my screen too.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you very much. Yeah. Because of time restraints, I actually think we have to postpone the Q&A actually. But you have given us ample opportunity now to contact you directly, which is even better, right? So yes, use that opportunity and contact Nathaniel. This is a great possibility for you that are here, that you can actually get a world expert to tell you a little bit more about this. So thank you, Nathaniel, that you would use so much time with us here, and God bless you.
Thank you so much.